would want to
Okay.
ask some
Are you okay
questions
if,
about.
okay. Is it all right if I record?
Yeah, and I'm okay in waiting.
Okay, well, I went ahead and started the recording. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen now. And let me just introduce the lecture, and then we can open up to questions and stuff on the lecture.
Sure, sure.
Um, so we're working with Pathwork Guide Lecture number 81. And that was offered originally March 3rd, 1961. And it's called Conflicts in the World of Duality. So let's open to just a general, like, anybody that read it and wants to comment or say anything about it, ask questions. That's good now. Oh, I think we lost we lost Jacob somehow. Okay.
Oh, we did?
Yeah.
Oh no, I'm here.
Oh, you're still here?
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
here.
okay.
I just don't have a general question. I had more of
Oh,
a
just as we go through.
specific question. I
Okay.
just wanted to say, yeah, just that there was stuff standing out to me about the childish way of loving and wanting to be loved versus the adult way. But then the way that it's phrased in here, I wanted to kind of slow down on and try to see what people's take on the certain phrasing is of the sentence. But really incredible stuff. I got quite a lot out of it. So without getting into that, that's
Okay.
well, I'll pause.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else have any general?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up something that's sort of like been a recurring theme or situation with me. It seems like all the lectures been reading lately have a lot to do with cosmology, and even this lecture had some cosmology in it. And I'm feeling like my personal feeling is that I need to know. I really need to know about the truth of the cosmology, and I'm wondering if this is like a real need or a false need, because there's this part of me, it's just like absolutely wants to and needs to know the cosmological truth of how the spiritual universe works.
So that's the quest, and I think it's a great question, Frank. But I think it's a little tricky because there are many uh, books that I've read that have spiritual validity, I believe, that have slightly different versions of the cosmology. So if we want to have like an exact accounting or something, I think what the guide says about that, is he says it's so vast and it's so complex in some ways. Anything anybody says about it is a kind of abbreviation, a kind of, pointing to kind of putting something vast into human language in some way that we might have some chance of comprehending. So it's kind of like, I think the cosmological truth is what the guide says. And, there are many different versions of reality from the different systems. And, maybe it's like the, unified theory that we're looking for at some level. And I think it is just, like as we evolve, as we progress, the theory, the thinking about it, the story of it is going to be less important than the direct knowing of it within our own instruments. And then each instrument, has certain limitations and certain capacities. So even beyond that, probably when we die, we'll have a much greater comprehension. But like the guide says, we're like huge, vast beings, kind of like squeezing into, like little tiny parts of this incarnational experience. And so it's difficult to comprehend except in sort of allegory and story and pointing. It's like, this myth
Yeah.
in some
Well,
sense.
I've come to sort of, I don't know, I sort of like came to some kind of a reconciliation with myself. And I pretty much said that, okay, I truly believe in the reincarnation part of the cosmology. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And really, that's like the most present part of it. That's like where I am in the present. I'm in this incarnation. And what happened actually eons ago, really, I don't know that it matters all that much anymore, because I'm here in this incarnation now, and I'm working on a task. And if, depending on how far along I get, whether will determine whether I come back again and work some more on the same task or work on another task or something like that, you know? So I feel like that's enough for now. But the question that I actually do have with myself is this need to know, is this a real need or is it a false need? You know?
I think it's a real need. I think there's a certain right that we have to this that is bubbling up inside, a longing for it, right? But it also, it's again this thing that is like we already have it, and yet, we have to develop it. We have to, step into it somehow. But it is already within us, and I think the longing. I mean, there may be some distortion. I mean, there's always a little divinity and distortion and everything that we have, right? So there may be, you can tune in and say, well, who is that has to know this, and see, maybe some part of you wants to know it for more egoic kinds of reasons. But I think that the real being that we are, I mean, that's what we're here for, is to penetrate the mystery.
Right.
And maybe we don't need to know, like you said, like, well, what's important is really what's here and now. So it's not like, we have to have that all figured out. But I find certain understandings of that useful, especially given sort of the ego story of what's going on, right? Or maybe some of the distorted patriarchal versions of this, like, at least to me, to have a life-giving story, which is what the guide gives us.
Yeah.
You know,
I've done a lot of thinking about how the guide says that everything that happens here is sort of an outcropping of what happens in the spirit world.
mm-hmm.
So I, I have this sense that our soul is actually the egoic part of our spirit. The soul was like split off. It's a subtle body of our spirit, the same way our ego is a subtle body of our physical presence here on this planet. And the soul actually still feels separated from the spirit in the spirit world. And this is how the soul, doing this work here, is how the soul actually helps itself get united again with the spirit.
Sounds possible.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the whole thing is definitely about reunification, right?
Yeah.
And the splits and the separation that's, not real at some level, but appears to be. So, okay. Anybody
What's
else?
been
That's
floating
great.
around in my head for a while.
No, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I guess it depends on how we define all of those things. It's like that. This is where having language for these things is hard, but I think, I follow what you're saying, and that certainly, I
I
think
mean,
there
I
is
just don't
a
think, I just
journey of
don't,
continuing reincorporation, like, it's concentric circles of vastness,
yeah.
and we're identified with like a little tiny part of it.
I just don't think that the soul is actually completely at ease in the spirit world. Otherwise, we wouldn't come back.
Well, yeah, that's true. I think. Well, and the guide actually says, no, we come back in service to God because, the soul isn't at ease in the sense that, like, there's one body of Christ, right? And so we all ascend or none of us ascend, right? It's like, and we come back again as bodhisattvas in a way, right? Like to continue. And the guide says, I like the other way that the guide talks about it too, because he talks about how, like the light is penetrating into the void, right? And we are parts of that light, just at the very edge of the void, where there's not a lot of consciousness and a lot of of awareness, but we are that light penetrating. And so, uh, we are the adventurers, or the ones going into, begin to enliven and bring the spirit and all to all of the places that are still disconnected, still don't know, still are unconscious and separated. So, this is, I think, he says what dignity it gives you to realize, that you're not your faults, you're not like you are a being who, in service of the light, comes back to bring the light
Yes.
into the darkness.
Bodhisattva.
So, but I think, I think you're also probably onto something. I don't know that the soul, I mean, I think when we do, pass, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden now we're completely enlightened.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. I think, and that's the way No Solar speaks of it in many of the Spiritist books. It's like we lose our defense structure, right?
Yeah,
And
I
then
believe
it takes
that.
a little while for the rest of the personality to, resolve and find another, whatever happens. But, it's like we continue, life goes on, and most of the mediums that I hear say, it's amazingly similar, to what you left behind.
Right.
And like you said, the guide says that's the source of this in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Darlene, you said something about that I found really curious. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit. You said that we all ascend or none of us ascend, right? Is that coming from that all of us are united and one, and there's this aspect to all of us that is interconnected and like as basically functioning as one unit and only
yeah, I think so. In a
appear to be
sense, all
separate?
consciousness is one consciousness, and all consciousness that is, separated from Christ consciousness, is where, that there's, and I think that there's a way in which, if if you look at a kind of, transformational process, I mean, like the whole universe, I think is moving into an awakening, and there's a way in which the the real understanding, and it's in this lecture too, it's like it's all one at some level, and there's different levels of development in this oneness. But that, in some ways they would say, we're already all there, right? It's kind of, a process, but there's a way that we're not doing it just for ourselves, and we are, I think, there's this idea of karma, and you're kind of on your own journey of cause and effect and crime and punishment, and, I don't think that's the correct understanding of karma. And I think, the guides is a better one. It's like we bring in parts of consciousness that are unevolved in order to, bring it to school here on the earth plane. And, we being the Christ consciousness. And we individually.
But they're somehow attached to us, right?
Not even necessarily. I mean, the guide says you can think of that, he says, maybe it's from a past life issue, but you could also think of it as just something that you really want to, work on, or, like expand in, so maybe there's a limitation there that you're aware of, or maybe you bring in a pain body that's connected, to somebody you love, or, you're doing an act of charity in some way. So, somehow, I don't know if you might, if you guys are interested in some of the, just opening up the possibilities, because I find that these books are really good at that. There's this guy, Francisco Xavier. He was a channel in Brazil. He's passed now. Very prolific guy, had like a third grade education. And there's a series of his works. I mean, there's over 400, and a lot of them are technical manuals on various things, but but there's a series called the Louise collection. I'll see if I can put it in the chat before we go. But so it's all about this doctor that died right at the beginning of World War One or two rather, and then he died of his own sort of self-destruction, and ends up in one of the hell realm areas, right, the lower astral, and he's there for about 7 years, suffering and not understanding, right, but then in paying attention he does, and in finding his own suffering, it drives him into prayer and compassion, and so he reaches out, and then he's helped and taken to this place of re-education and healing. Um, and then he continues after he receives his understanding and healing to be in service in the astral by, working with uh, various spiritual orders that are sent to come and help people on earth through people praying for them and stuff like that. So there's this, the guide has this one lecture on the influence between the material and the spiritual worlds, and he's saying that there's this huge interchange. And so, and in these books you can see some of the pain bodies or the distortions people bring in, and you can see some of the ancestral things that people bring in. It's a little more uh, Catholic, or more moral in some senses, I think. But it's a very beautiful. They're in general very loving, very beautiful descriptions of the care for in the spiritual world for the ones here, and even when we're completely lost and in darkness, how great the compassion and the desire for healing is on behalf of all of the ones that are holding those incarnate. And the understanding is when we incarnate, it's like it's a great appreciation by the spiritual world, like this is no mean feat, it's a huge task we take on. They recognize it, they honor it, they feel very grateful for all those here on earth struggling in the material. It's a lot harder here.
Is that what that movie No Solar is based on?
Yeah. And there's a series of books. They're on Amazon. You can get them on Kindle for a few, not very expensive. And it starts with No Solar. There's, I think, about 13 of the 28 that are translated. And some of them, like I think the next one is Life Goes On. And then there's, you might have to explore around. I haven't quite ever figured out like an order to them, but it does seem that some of them I get into and I think I don't understand where we are. So I think there is one. But they're just different, and different aspects, and different stories about individuals here on earth, and their history, and the way that the spirit realm is trying to help them. So
it's a long intro.
Okay.
Long intro.
Should we get into the lecture? Jacob, did that help you at all? I don't know whether that answered your question or not.
Yeah, that's good for now. I got some more detailed questions about it, but I'd like to get into the lecture so we can move forward.
Okay. So, greetings. God bless all of you, my dearest friends. Blessed is this hour. On this path, you are going through various phases. Broadly speaking, so far we have investigated the first level of your unconscious mind. It is the level on which you harbor wrong impressions and conclusions formed into rigid generalizations about specific different aspects of life. We call these rigid forms in the soul images. Some of these may be in themselves insignificant, yet they are important enough to distort your life. So just maybe to even help Faye a little, that are you still with us there?
I am.
Yeah, okay, good. I can't see everybody. I don't like the way Zoom does it when I'm sharing a screen. I'm limited to not being able to see everybody who's on. But anyway, so yeah. So the image is just these impressions that are formed in the soul that in even from other lifetimes, like let's say you died in a difficult situation, and maybe it was like you froze to death or something like that, and so you come back in, and you have a real strong aversion to being cold, right? And you believe, maybe you also had a person that left you out there, right? Maybe it was a close person like a mother or something, and so you end up coming in with these impressions and beliefs about life, and then you set it up so that you're actually also choosing parents and choosing experiences in this lifetime that are going to activate these forms in the soul, because this is really what we're trying to do, is clear those out. They're just they're incorrect, right? They're usually, not that they're completely wrong, but they are what he calls overgeneralizations. So we have a bad experience with one person, and then we say, well, all people like that are that way or are bad, right? We have one lifetime where we die of cold, and we think we're going to die of freezing or something, and so we farm defenses where we have these fears and these negative beliefs about experience. And then those defenses actually are part of the recreation, right? And so we're sort of working in a dream realm. It's like a projection. The guide says our whole life is a working through internally through these images and forms in the soul. And so when this is like one layer, of the personality and the difficulties that we come in with. So he's saying we have penetrated into the world of duality, which is below the superficial level of your subconscious mind. It is on this deeper level where the battle between the opposites is waged. So underneath the images is this other dynamic. And he says the battle creates a tremendous confusion in your life. So this is where we get split, right? And where we're split, we're trying to unify. Um, and it's really, in a way, all other human beings are just representations of this split externally rather than internally, right? So that's one way of looking at the one body idea. So the confusion concerns the big issues as well as the lesser ones. The great opposites are life and death, happiness and unhappiness, love and selfishness, and light and darkness. And so I know we're most familiar with, like, happiness versus unhappiness, or, like the conflict between, oh, should I be good and take care of everybody else, which is what we think is love, or should I take care of me, which we think is selfishness? And the guide in various lectures works through these confusions, because usually we have, there's distortion and divinity on both sides, and we're fighting inside of ourselves between two false poles. Um, so so part of this, work is to find our way into unifying these inner splits and conflicts. He says your confusion comes about because a certain attitude toward life that is supposed to lead you to the desired goal often brings with it, at least to some degree, the undesired one. And then it takes a great deal of self-honesty and awareness to understand this phenomenon and detect the inner error of action and reaction responsible for this confusing result. And in some ways, it's like, that's just part of life too. He says, we live in this world of duality. So, just because we also have some of the undesired things, it's important to look at maybe where we have some creation in that, some responsibility in that. But it can also be, just a part of reality at this stage, right? In this world. Duality doesn't have to, just because there is actually, day and night, right? But in the spiritual understanding, it's the Tao, it's the continual movement. The guide talks about perfectionism of, not a static perfection, but a continually transforming perfection. And so, all of this is relevant. He says, religion symbolizes the struggle between opposites, as the struggle between God and the devil. And the confusions originating from this duality are said to be Satan's trick to deceive humankind. I think this is actually a useful allegory, right? It's like you can personify it this way as long as you don't start feeling like, oh, the devil made me do it, right? But there is a way. And if we understand, that again, Satan is internal, right? We all have Christ consciousness. We all have Luciferic consciousness, right? And so the duality, Satan, is the ego at some level, right? And there is all this confusion. So we can no longer distinguish between God's way and the devil's. That which is intrinsically selfish and destructive often appears on a superficial level as righteous and holy, and vice versa. The distortion of truth into falsehood is part of the great battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, which human beings erroneously imagine to be raging outside themselves. And then they tend to believe that they are merely victims caught in the middle. So this is saying the same thing, like, this is an internal thing that's happening, and the projection of our three-dimensional reality is, like really an outpicturing of this inner uh, conflict within ourselves. And each one of us, like we are embodying similar conflicts. I mean, we recognize each other, in these places where we're lost, right? Um, so in some sense, these are universal conflicts for certain stages of development that we're all in. So once again, we're all one at some level, or it's all one consciousness underlying all of the individual forms. So having to choose between everyday alternatives that confront you often generates confusion. These alternatives are not crassly good or bad. They both stem from the same basic struggle in the human soul. Modern psychology has recognized the same fundamental problem, calling it the life instinct versus the death instinct, or the pleasure principle versus the reality principle. In connection with the reality principle, however, there is also confusion. So often people are not clear which principle stands for God and which for the devil. Is the pleasure principle selfish and therefore destructive? Can you indulge in it without hurting others? Does the reality principle stand for duty, responsibility, work, achievement, and therefore is constructive? On the other hand, we're told that God is happiness, bliss, light, and the pleasure principle makes you yearn for that. Whether you know it or not, right at this point, you are engulfed in one of humanity's major confusions. So do you all recognize that in your own lives, where you get caught in your own desires, that, and then, in relationship, this comes up, I think, or, in general, like, just around, so also do we recycle or, like get a vaccination, like, are we, you know, being, working with sort of being the responsible and the dutiful, or, what's the pleasure? Is it the truth to say, oh, let's be free and, not be forced into getting vaccinations, and is that the higher freedom, right? Or is the higher good that we, try to take care of each other by becoming vaccinated and, block this thing from coming on. So, there's both sides to it, and so this is where the guide is always talking about, it's like, you can't resolve it in a splitting. You have to integrate the two. They're both true in some sense, and they're both false in some sense. And usually we try to take one side and make that the one that we're trying to become, or the one that's good, or the one that's right, and it doesn't deepen the work, right? We just get caught in between the two, because we can, do our best to be good, but eventually, we're gonna be tempted away, or there's something that will happen that, you know, we'll go for the happiness instead of the goodness, because we get so bored with the goodness, or we get, something, we need something more than that, right? Just our idealized self-image saying, oh, aren't you a good person? So underneath all the conflicts you have discovered through the work on this path is a larger conflict, always related to your world of duality. Behind your images and misconceptions, you'll always find conflict. In one way or another, you find that you are torn between several alternatives. By stripping away the superimposed motivations, at the core, you are bound to find the basic opposites. But this level of duality on which you are torn between the opposites is still not the core. Behind it is the origin of the world of duality, just as the world of duality is where your images originate. Strangely enough, the underlying source becomes on the next level one side of two opposites. And in other words, the source, which is the unified core, on the next level of consciousness splits into two opposites. And this is also something that all religions talk about, that there's this, unified God that becomes the masculine and the feminine, that becomes the light and the dark, that, becomes the there's one story that says, and the angel of heaven cleaved the union in two so that creation might begin, right? The the movement has to come from, poles in some sense, but whether we make them into conflicting opposites or not is the question. And within this underlying core, where it is all unified, is your longing for complete happiness, light, love, bliss, and peace. So whenever we go into the very heart of anything, I think we can usually find this, and I find it very beautiful to find this, like when I'm struggling, when I'm, in pain, or I feel like I'm judging myself or something like that, I'm judging something I did, if I follow it all the way to, what I was up to, and yes, maybe there was some, lower self pieces or some other things going on, but the fundamental bottom line is always, acting under this longing for complete happiness, light, love, bliss, and peace. And the original longing is for happiness supreme, but life on earth prohibits such fulfillment. And this prohibition creates the world of duality, and therefore your conflict. So we have to kind of face this sort of reality that it can't always be, like pleasant in the way that we think of pleasure. Now, what actually happens in this world of duality is we discover that even the difficulties, the trials, the challenges, right, they also hold value. They also become good. And so we unify in that process, right? But from the pure sort of creaturely place, like certain things are painful and certain things are pleasurable, and we would much rather be in pleasure than in pain, right? And then we have to look at all of the ways that we create our own suffering, because this is the real major key, because so much of, what the world holds for us is like a fraction of what we create for ourselves. And in some ways, we come into this world and it seems huge and it seems complex, and we don't get a manual to understand what we're here for, what we're supposed to be doing, or how to do it, how to work with it, how to deal with our feelings and all of everything that happens. So, we're really, sort of immersed, thrown into this world of duality. And then, it's through the lifetime, that we sort of walking in this world of duality, we learn naturally, how to accept, how to surrender, how to balance, how to see the good within what we thought was all bad over time. So I digress a little, but I think it's like really a beautiful way, this journey that God has us go on in some ways, but it's not for sissies. It's not easy, right? It's a, what I say in my hymns is, this is, say, remember, my brothers and sisters, we're not here for a vacation. The difficulties arise for our edification, right? And so the difficulties can be embraced as well. So it's equally true to say that the world of duality created this prohibition, right? Like the prohibition creates the world of duality. I maybe skipped something. So the underlying core is our longing for complete happiness, light, love, bliss, peace. And the original longing is for happiness supreme. But with a life on earth where that's prohibited, it creates this conflict. And yet, he's saying it's also true that our own internal duality, right? Again, how we hold it, and this is what we end up doing, as we resolve it, created the prohibition that we can't have complete happiness. And so, I don't know whether we ever go back entirely to the Garden of Eden, but I know that we can live a life in the material realm with a lot less suffering. And that, I think, is, my sense is it's not like we're trying to get past the wheel of karma so we never have to incarnate again. My belief is that we get more and more fully capable, like Jesus, for instance, other avatars, of incarnating with the light. And then, what we create from there is a co-creation with God. So, where it created the life conditions on earth, which made reality something opposed to the pleasure principle, in spiritual terms, the reality on earth opposes this divine principle of bliss. And then this puts us into a vicious circle. In the first place, in order to get out of it, we have to understand what is responsible, at least in part, for the human being's creation of duality out of a single core. Life on earth necessarily involves physical death. Even if we remove many of life's miseries as unnecessary, as created out of confusion, physical death still remains. It is still a mystery, unknown, and therefore frightening, in spite of religious faith. It seems to be an end. As such, it is in crass opposition to the longing for life. And life, in essence, means bliss. All the religious explanations, however true they may be, are still conjectures. Thus, by following through in logical steps, we see that the fear of death creates the world of duality. And the world of duality creates a reality that says no to humanity's longing for complete fulfillment. This leaves us with the problem of death. It is by dealing with it that we can break the vicious circle. And so this is, some of us are working with the Dying into Life program. And so this is, one of the lectures that is useful in that process, as well as we kind of like the whole process is configured around this, right? So humanity has tried to cope with the problem of death for as long as it has existed. Unfortunately, these attempts were unsatisfactory and were bound to fail, just as your unconscious attempt to solve psychological problems by shortcuts and evasions are doomed to fail. Instead of facing the issue squarely, you superimpose ready-made answers which may be true as such, but they are not true for you personally, because you have not arrived at them, using the strength and courage that come only from facing the issue. You choose rather the way of avoidance out of fear and weakness. This is one way of trying to deal with the problem. And many religious people cling to faith out of fear. And these are examples of those who want to avoid confronting the reality of death on this earth. Another attempt to deal with the problem of death is through negation of the very thing for which one longs most deeply. Humanity longs for bliss and eternal life. but many who desire it are terrified of not attaining it, and therefore they rush right into the negation of what they long for most. This self-destructiveness can be found on all levels. It manifests in your attitude toward less significant aspects of life, but it is basically your way of coping with the problem of death. The atheist, materialist, and the superficially religious who want to avoid death by superimposed faith are two prototypes. Neither realizes that each is doing essentially the same thing, that is throwing away what they most desire. So does that make sense?
Throwing away what they most desire is equals what?
Life, pleasure, the bliss, pleasure supreme, right? Like in a sense, as long as we recognize that death is here and we can't avoid it, right? There's something in us that kind of gets fatalistic or something, like I was having a session earlier today, and it's also kind of in that superstition of pessimism, right? That I'm scared to really believe in the good, because somehow believing in the bad protects me, right? I can't hope, I can't long, I can't want for so much because it's really not possible here, right? So, and it's not possible even if everything was perfect, like death would get me in the long run. So, we're always sort of up against this fatalism that then denies this deeper longing inside on one level, and then the other way he says is to have this kind of superficial faith, right? um, but it doesn't really address the need. We're just in denial that we're even afraid of death, right?
So if you avoid the positive, then you don't have to suffer as much because you're already in the negative or some such nonsense.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Well, sometimes I would avoid having too much pleasure when I was younger because that way I wouldn't have to suffer the pain of losing.
Yes,
But
exactly. Yeah. Right. So we deny this thing that we basically desire, right? Because death makes it seem fruitless at some ultimate level. And that's deep inside. I don't know whether you were consciously recognizing that, but if you think about it and go in, it's like there are these places inside of us. And I know for my dream, we actually put in an offer now on Forest Gardens, 51 acres, almost $1 million. Like I never thought we would even get this far, right? But there was a point where, it kind of the universe had to coach me, because I kind of, well, I'll put it out, and maybe something great will happen. Of course, nothing wonderful happened. So it kept kind of up in the ante, right? And it kept bringing in the possibilities such that, I would, really fully say yes to this, which would be some part of my pleasure supreme, right? And that doesn't mean that it's not going to be challenging and have a lot of I'm not buying 1700s mansion with all kinds of problems is not going to be challenge free, right? But these are the kinds of things that like if we don't follow our bliss, if we don't follow something inside that guides us, um this is often because we're foreshadowed with this death thing.
well, the challenges then would be part of your growth opportunity to keep evolving.
Exactly. Like, I mean, there are times when I would think, am I crazy taking all this on, and I'm sure, some, if I hadn't already said, yes, in a different way, right, I could have talked myself out of it, like there's lots of reasons, to not say yes to something like that. And then, maybe it'll totally fail. I don't know, right? We have no guarantees. So it's kind of like this jumping off the cliff, and that's when we discover that there is no duality, that we do soar. Even if we crash to the bottom, it's like we get up and try again. I don't know, right? There's ultimately death is not real, that there's resurrection after everyone, right? So he says, my speaking of the longing for God may sound distant and abstract. When you try to imagine the divine bliss that spirits enjoy, your automatic association produces something that is usually quite different from the happiness which you as human beings long for. You imagine the bliss of heaven as something dull, sterile, uninteresting. There are many people who believe that the very presence of unhappiness is what gives happiness its flavor. Of course, this is not so. Since the word happiness to most of you connotes such vague and distant spirituality, let us use the phrase pleasure supreme on all levels of your being instead. Your deep-rooted longing for this pleasure supreme is constantly in conflict with reality as you know it on earth. This is the result of your inability to come to terms with death. Modern psychology claims that this deep-seated longing stems from the desire to return to the womb, where the fetus lived in a state of being without worry, responsibility, or hardship. But the longing of the human being goes back further than the mother's womb. The truth is that you all have embedded in your spirit the vague memory of a life in another state of consciousness, when you knew nothing but supreme bliss without any opposing alternative. You can recapture this state gradually by stages and to a degree even while you are still an incarnated entity. It is not enough to remove your images and wrong conclusions. However, as you do so, you are bound to encounter the level of the duality. Once you comprehend it at its deepest core, you come face to face with your struggle against death, or anti-pleasure, if you may call it that. So, this is where, he talks about sort of all of life is the struggle against death, in this sort of defense state that we're in, right? Because we're defending against anything that we feel is anti-pleasure, trying to, control the world in this way so that we can only have what we want. So self-will comes in there, right? We have the fears that then block, because we might not get what we want, and then now we're afraid that we don't get what we want, and so all of this stuff kind of weaves together in this, place where humanity gets completely lost. And so he says, as I've indicated before, there are two major ways which the unconsciousness attempts to cope with death. Both are based on negation, one by evasion and the other by deliberately going into what you are most afraid of. In both alternatives, you struggle desperately against death. You struggle no less when you deliberately choose death out of cringing fear, in a negative spirit of weakness. It is an altogether different choice to accept death in a healthy way, out of strength. When I use the word death, I do not mean merely physical death. I refer to all the negative aspects of life, everything that opposes your pleasure drive. In that sense, death also means loss, change, and the unknown that may actually contain something better than the state you are in. But by the very fact that it is unknown, it becomes terrifying. There is no human being who does not die many little deaths every day. Your attitude. Did somebody want to say something?
Yeah, question real quick.
Yeah.
Could you give a little example on, see, I'm a little confused between choosing death. How does it phrased up there, to avoid it? I'm not quite clear.
Right. He's saying some people, actually deny life out of fear of death. And therefore, in a sense, you're choosing death, like you're not even giving life a chance.
Okay, because when you get negative things come up, I choose to go into them now, but I don't think
different.
that's,
Yeah,
okay.
That's different. Yeah. yeah, that's, it's like now you're choosing to be present, which is bringing life into the state of death, which will help transform it, is my sense, right? So,
Thank you.
so when I use the word death, I do not mean merely physical death. I refer to all the negative aspects of life, everything that opposes your pleasure drive. In that sense, death also means loss, change, and the unknown. There is no human being who does not die many little deaths every day. Your attitude toward death in all its aspects determines your ability to live and experience pleasure. So it's not like whether death is here or not, it's like we don't have to wait until there is no death in order to live and experience pleasure, is part of what he's saying. The healthier our attitude toward death, the more life force can flow through you, and therefore the more healthy and enduring will be the gratification of your pleasure drive. Your first step is to detect how much you struggle against death. Become fully aware of this, just as you need to become fully aware of the constant longing for pleasure supreme. So every time we have a disappointment, every time things don't go our way, every time, I'm really sensitive to the flow of things, right? And if there's little hiccups in the force or something, right? Like it feels like a death to me. there's a way in which it, like I sense, okay, it's not, everything's not all in pleasure and all smooth and some things, I get some frustration out of dealing with systems and the way things are in the world, so I get into a battle against death, in these little ways. I'm trying to call people for the inspections, right? I'm trying to understand what we're dealing with, and so far I've been pretty good with those things, but there are certain situations, I think I've spoke before, where I really get into a battle against the death of how things are. We gotta change it, right? Can't stand it the way it is. Have to make it change, have to make it different. And so where we feel that's like our refusal to surrender, our self-will, our attempt to avoid death in that way. And that usually just brings on more struggle, more pain, more unhappiness.
It just kind of struck me that this whole culture, especially the Western culture, economically and almost socially, it's all built on the avoidance of pain and the gain of some pleasure at whatever cost. And it's like it's missing the entire point of this lecture. It's incredibly dysfunctional.
Exactly. No, exactly. It is. And again, I think our Western culture is the epitome of the egoic consciousness arisen to its highest achievements, right? And there are some, but also, a mixed bag. and exactly what you're saying, and this is why our whole culture is kind of adolescent, right? We refuse death. We refuse to be mature. We refuse to, face reality, because we're still fighting against death, and by doing that, we are taking away the true pleasure supreme that is here already, that is available for us, and we're destroying the earth and each other in the process. So I need to mark where I stop reading. I'm sorry, I keep reading over again. Does anybody remember?
Sorry, anyway.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just start with the so you're torn between two unsatisfactory and damaging attempts to negate death. These artificial, forceful, and cramped attempts bring you so much nearer to what you want to avoid, and you forfeit that which you wish to gain. So it is not in acceptance itself that you find strength and healing, but in how you choose to accept death. Acceptance mixed with fear and negativity, both of which lead to self-destructiveness, is altogether different from a healthy, strong acceptance of the inevitable. Squarely facing it, not cringing from it, you will come to terms with it, thereby freeing the life force in you, which remains bottled up as long as you do not learn to cope with death in a healthy way. You sense that the solution lies in acceptance, but you also believe that in acceptance lies annihilation. As long as this confusion is not brought into consciousness, you cannot begin to find your way out of the maze. The superimposed faith has no real power to help, he's talking about the sort of a religious evasion. Again, sort of faced with confusion, people resort to religion in any of its various forms, but they do it in the spirit of evasion and fear. Thus, religion, no matter how true its teachings, will not really help, just as the wrong kind of acceptance does not help. This kind of religiousness will not help because it is accepted out of weakness, which pollutes people's motives. Deeply sensing the untruth of their motivations, they despise themselves for it. Moreover, the superimposed faith has no real power to help them. They accept God and everything that belief in God implies, not out of real conviction nor out of deep, genuine insight, but because they are afraid. Thus, the enemies of religion are often right when they say that religion is an opiate. By the same token, the enemies of materialism are right when they reject the materialistic point of view, not only because it is not true, but also because the motivation for accepting that is also fear. The more we look into the subject, the more we find that the solution lies in facing the unknown and confronting the fear of it. The task is learning the strength to die, for only the person who knows how to die knows how to live. And this is something in the native tradition too, it's like, it's kind of a deep reality, right? It's a good day to die. Like, we have to be willing to face, what life brings in a spirit of hopefulness and, positivity and courage. So needless to say, you do not have to wait to experience actual physical death in order to learn how to die. Not only can your occasional conscious fear of anything that connotes death help you, but also all the other aspects of death that comprise daily living. If you do not know how to die, you cannot live, because you cannot reconcile the opposites that constitute the dualism in your own soul. Hence, you cannot free the life force that lies within, unutilized. So examine your faith too, my friends. Do not be afraid to recognize that to whatever degree it also is an intellectual superimposition to which you cling out of weakness and fear. Such a frank admission will give you the very strength to build a genuine faith that is also a conviction and a knowledge. Where are people in general with that? Does that make sense? And do you sense the difference between this deeper conviction and knowledge and sort of a clinging fear-based faith? I mean, I remember when I first was in the Daime, they taught this reciting this prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, right? And I had read, like, if you keep repeating it, it kind of becomes one with the breath. And so I did that for a while, and then I realized, yeah, like every time I'm feeling, something anxious, that prayer is there. But if I say it from the place where it comes up in, which is usually, kind of anxious and, help, 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 it's like it. I'm too tense. I'm already like not connected to receiving the help, right? So I can, say that, or pray. I know a lot of people, are pleading with God, but from that place of pleading, somehow you don't feel like you deserve it, or you don't feel like you can have it, right? So there's a way that we can, work with sort of deepening and feeling the truth of, spiritual reality, even though we may not understand the entire metaphysical, aspects of it. It will
In
come.
my experience, Darlene,
Go ahead. Yeah.
in my experience, not to oversimplify, but it's experience as either acceptance and surrendering to the now versus some kind of form of avoidance, whether it's through food or some thought that brings me comfort, or something that is trying to avoid whatever the moment is or whatever is coming through me, whether it's emotional or an idea or a memory or something of that nature. So it, you can kind of sense whether, well, when I'm more connected, whether I'm trying to avoid and take myself somewhere else, or if I am willing to surrender and just kind of see what happens.
So when you are willing to surrender, do you know, like, I mean, I think this is the key, right? It's like where we're too scared, we can't make that surrender, right? Where we're too in defense. And so, like, when we're surrendering, there's something in us that's surrendering to some kind of faith, right? I mean, it may be faith in your higher self, it may be faith in the flow of the universe, it may be faith in, just in general, like, okay, this should work out, from logical or whatever.
Right. Yeah. For me, it's some of the larger moments that I remember having these kinds of confrontations. It's been more of a faith that nothing has happened in the past. Like there might be some things that I'm unfamiliar with, but other challenges, it's almost like a memory, like, okay, well, nothing happened during those moments. And there have been times where certain fear was there. I remember having some nightmares when I was younger. I was in my teens, and just really intense nightmares. And a part of me at some point just said, you know what, I'd rather die. Like I would be okay with dying. This is going to be how it is for the rest of my life. I would be okay with dying. So I'm going to jump into this facing of this fear. If it means death, then so be it. But I want to see what's on the other side of it, basically. Like I have to face it. And so once I kind of dove into that and nothing happened, well, I mean, there was relief and I faced my fear. There was a transformational experience where that nightmare didn't come back. I mean, it kind of sort of came back maybe one or two more times, but
right.
The experience
Sure.
was that there's nothing to fear.
Yeah, great. Yeah. And this is, I mean, I think this is really like step by step in life, it teaches, and we learn and we trust a little more and we keep going and I think we look around and we see all the terrible things that can happen to everybody, and we probably have our past lives full of other things, as well. But here we are, right? We didn't die at some level. So there is this way that, it's the shaman's death, right? It's having recognizing, and oftentimes it is like, well, like there is a death. I'm going to die if I don't jump off this cliff, so I might as well just die, take the quick, short death instead of the long, slow death. But most of the time we prefer the long, slow death. And yet when we can wake up and face that, and jump off that cliff, that's what sets us free. Then we recognize there wasn't anything really there in the first place, as you were saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there's a way in which if you take the great courageous step to face your unbelief, your uncertainty, and your fear, and so that's a facing as well, right? Facing the fear, facing what is. Come to terms with them by accepting the unknown. You will build up your strength and make room for true conviction and the experience of spiritual truth. And then it will become part of you because, you then learn to live. The life force will be released, and a great measure of your longing for bliss will be fulfilled while still on earth. Seek and you shall find an area of your being that clings to life only in order to avoid death. So where the motivation is negative, it negates the life force itself. Where you face and come to terms with death, you embrace of life will have a positive spirit. And this alone can solve the problem of duality, since duality arises out of negation. So like, let that sink in a little bit, right? You know, instead of, it's like the guide has some lectures on the no and the yes current, right? Remember those? And so, you know, in some ways we're trying to practice always saying yes. Right? Saying yes to what arises, what is. Not that we can't change, or that, you know, that there isn't something that maybe we're learning from, and it's, you know, it's in its perfection in the moment to teach us what we need, you know, but we're saying yes to that too. So if it's a problem, if it's a mirror of a difficulty, if it's some kind of suffering, we can learn, instead of contracting against it, which is what the defense does. We can learn to surrender and say yes to this too. And then I think once we fully like do that, open and say yes, then we can kind of go to that serenity prayer, right? You know, and see like, well, you know, is there something I can change here or not, right? You know, accept the things I cannot change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. But we can't get to that wisdom to know the difference. And if we go to the negation, if we go to the no, that will fundamentally block that. So, you know, we're saying yes to even some things that seem impossible to say yes to, right? And yet that's the way through the eye of the needle. The problem of duality has to be tackled eventually along the road of development and growth. For some, it will surface sooner and others later, but it must come for everyone. Do not fear that you are being disloyal to your faith when you face that part of it which is superimposed on your terror of death. For only then can you truly become strong from knowing and accepting the uncertainty of death in small ways every day. So it's like, again, be vulnerable, right? You know, like the mind is so intent on control and you know, like making sure that we don't have uncertainty. And we really don't. It's hard to live. It's like stressful for the ego, you know, to be in uncertainty. And yet there is a kind of development, I think, that we're trying to just tune in and trust in the flow. And the mind, instead of figuring it out, can just receive in the moment what's next and what's next and what's next. And then the uncertainty of death, right? You know, it's like, it's just kind of, well, we don't know what'll come afterwards, right? It seems like it's the end, or it seems like what'll come afterwards might be worse than what we have now. And go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like the experiential part of the equation, where that last sentence where he said, for only then can you truly become strong from knowing and accepting the uncertainty of death in small ways every day, which is kind of tied into the line that he said way in the beginning of the lecture, that human beings die many deaths every day. Well, if we could only become conscious of how we do that to ourselves, and all those little mini deaths that we seem to die every day, in an unconscious way, really, you know, if we could become conscious to that, that would be the experiential part of the equation,
right?
wouldn't it?
And I don't know, I mean, you know, but maybe, I mean, I sense that there's a way to like recognize that through what he's calling this negation, right? Like when are you in resistance? to what is.
I'm in resistance to a lot of things that I'm, that come up every day.
Exactly.
I'm like, my general go-to is like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's too much trouble. Or I'm not going to do that because if I do that, chances are this will happen, and I don't want to deal with that when this happens. It's like I'm always kind of calculating the negative outcome of the possibilities, which is, that's dying
Yeah.
on the vine. That's like
One of the
fruit rotting
laws
on the
of-
vine.
Right, right.
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And I mean, it's a discernment we have free will, it is a choice, God-given choice, and bless you to make your choice, right? Because that's how we learn. And the more conscious we can be of the consequences of those choices, the more we're going to grow and recognize and learn.
I mean, because I feel like there has to be some kind of an experiential to this
Exactly.
lecture. Otherwise, it's all just, intellectual stuff.
No, I mean, I agree with you, but I think that this is what he's saying all the way through. That we die deaths all the time, and that all he says I don't know if it's in this lecture or another one, but he says, you practice your big death by dying all of these little deaths in life.
Yeah.
And so, we're learning how to surrender, and we don't do it very well. and again, it may even be that you choose not to do something that you think you should, right? And that wouldn't be necessarily considered a death. You're going into your own inner authority. You're making your inner, you're examining the choice and making it consciously.
Well, a lot of times we call it a rationalization, but if we looked at it a little bit deeper, it would just be an avoidance.
Right. And so then when you can recognize, okay, so I'm going negative, I'm in resistance.
Yeah.
That can be like, I mean, that will give you enough practical work to do every day of your life for the rest of it, and it's like, that's what we're sitting with. That's what, and every time life brings it up, I mean, that's what life does. It's gonna confront us with something that we have resistance to. It has to, so that we can do this work, right? So we're magnetizing all of those things that we don't want and that we resist to us, so we can learn how to let go of the resistance.
Yeah, and something else that just came to me, Darlene, is it almost sounds like, because I've been thinking about what is pleasure supreme. Pleasure supreme just might be not having any fear. Period.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. I mean, this is one of the things that, again, the guide talks about, and I find that where I apply it and experience it, right, is with my force bathing and the nature communion, right? Because it's like there I feel safe enough to become more open in my sensory, right? More vulnerable, more permeable, more receptive, right, to the flows and the communications and the beauty around me, right? And the thrill, the wonder, the pleasure that comes in as I receive that, right? Like there's the Garden of Eden again, right? And there's a great beauty and pleasure, and when we can be sensitized. This is why the guide says that all of our defenses are such deadeners of life, because we block off the pain, but we equally block out the pleasure. And the pleasure is in this contemplative now moment. I know I have difficulty sometimes in groups, and I know this intellectually, I can't always get present enough, with it, but the thing is, I look around and everybody's in a tete-a-tete with somebody else, and I'm kind of standing there by myself, like, who do I talk to? And there's nobody really there. And so it's kind of like I just, fade into the wallflower or whatever, or I go start doing something. Often I like to clean, or I'll start picking up the room or something like that. But it's this interesting kind of dynamic that, like, I realize, okay, if I would just ground and stand there and experience the beauty of watching all my brothers and sisters sharing with each other, instead of getting self-absorbed into some story about why am I by myself or something, and just receive the glory of, all of my, friends are enjoying each other, and, whatever, we had a beautiful time, and, and so what if I'm, it doesn't mean anything, right? Or maybe I'm supposed to clean up, or, but if I can really take in, and I miss all of that because I'm always in my mental judgments about and stories about what's here now, instead of actually being here now, and having the bliss that is inherent in each moment, receiving that. Right?
Or maybe you can choose just to be with the experience of being by yourself, even as it's uncomfortable, or see what's underneath that.
Exactly. And for me, when I shift out of the story and I'm just in the sensational, sometimes they're kind of weird, or sometimes a little uncomfortable, sometimes difficult to tolerate even, but most of the time, it's just weird. It's just sensations, right? It's like, it's just new sensory input, like sometimes, like a lemon is a little sour, or the, certain smells can be overwhelming, right? It's like, but they're not inherently bad, right? So my mind doesn't have to get in there and say, oh, danger, danger, never, never smell the lemon again. It's like, so there's ways that we do create this mental construct of life around us that we have to defend against, and then, we're always trying to find the pleasure and avoid the pain, which leads us more and more into the pain.
Yeah, well, I just using that example though, when sometimes it happens to me when I'm in a group or something, I'm alone, and it's immediately what comes up for me is my abandonment stuff, like, oh, hell, see, nobody likes me and I'm doing something wrong, or yada yada, and I get to watch that if I'm conscious enough and awake enough. But it's instead of running, trying to find somebody to talk to, just kind of, it's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's the story that's the lie, right? That's the temptation to leave the beauty of what's really here, that you'll miss the minute you go connect with your story, right? And maybe there is, we do that all the time, like you said, and so then when we do that, one option is to go, well, can I come back, and just let that go? But if not, that's exactly what we need to do, is be with that consciously, and realize that there's beauty in that, like, oh, so the universe has offered me another opportunity to hold and heal this old dynamic, right? And if I wake up, like you said, and are not completely unconscious of it, I don't suffer with it in the same way, right? So many aspects of civilized life stand in the way of the supreme bliss that could be had to some degree even on Earth. They are direct result of the inner duality, which in turn comes from the inability to die. Civilized life constantly imposes on you the alternatives of pleasure and unpleasure. Let us consider, for instance, the work that is not always according to your creative abilities and inclinations, and therefore not according to your liking or pleasure. The conditions of work with all their musts, which stem from political, economic, and sociological factors, are again themselves a result of the inner duality that necessitates a struggle for living. I remember hearing, some New Age person talk about, we literally have to make a living. We have to earn a living, right? And it's like that image, like it's an image, that says, oh, we have to toil by our brows. I think it goes back, when God kicked us out of the Garden of Eden, right? And there is responsibility, and it's not like I'm saying deny responsibility, but I'm saying that there's a kind of way that we don't feel that the world will take care of us, that cares for us, that like we have to do it all by ourselves, and it's dog eat dog out there and all of that, right? And a work is one I think that people struggle with a lot. I know I did as a young person. I mean, I feel very blessed that I was able to find my way into doing something I loved rather than, working for somebody else. But I did that for many years and put in my time, right? And so um, when it's like that, he says, this this encourages ambitiousness, drives, and compulsions. In addition, these often confront one with obligations that may only be necessary within the framework of your present life on earth. In these ways, a reality principle is created that stands in clear opposition to the longing for and the fulfillment of happiness that could be yours. Here, individual inner problems have collectively brought about a state of civilization that makes life unnecessarily difficult. That's what we're trying to transform now, right? Thus, your often unpleasant reality is in many respects unnecessary and shows up as a collective manifestation of the inner duality. As each person begins to face this problem within, he or she helps to change the world and these conditions in ever so subtle but nevertheless decisive ways. As you focus on these problems within yourself, you become able to cope with the unnecessary duality in a much healthier way. Simultaneously, you also help to change the overly harsh collective reality principle. So now he's shifting gears. So let me pause there a second. Anything more on that? So now I wish to touch upon another conflict and confusion. In the course of this work, you may have become acutely aware of the desire for happiness, love, fulfillment, or to put it in the words I used tonight, pleasure supreme. You have discovered that much of this longing comes from your unfulfillment as a child, now manifesting as exaggerated craving. So this is where, we also have to see where the child thinks that, in order for things to be good, like it all has to be perfect. And if one little thing is imperfect, it's all messed up, right? And so the perfectionism and the demand of the child, right, is part of what we're trying to, move beyond, right? So that it becomes an unreal and exaggerating craving. And so he says, you learn to distinguish between the healthy wish for mature love and the childish craving need to be loved. With the help of this awareness, you free yourself to some extent from the craving. Nevertheless, it is necessary for you to understand also the origin of the excessive demand. This need comes from a vague memory embedded in the spirit. Now you may ask, if this wish has a spiritual origin, then why is it unhealthy? Part of the answer is that it is impossible to gratify such excessive expectations on this earth, given the reality that humankind has created. Nor is it enough to say that childish craving is one-sided while mature love is willing to give and love as fully as one wishes to receive. There's another lecture where he talks
Darlene,
about, yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead. That's where I wanted to ask you, but go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, he was talking about, in another lecture on real and false needs, right? That the child's, it's the child's need to be loved, right? And the adult, the real need, it becomes a false need as an adult. And of course, when it wasn't met, there's still a hole, but the real adult need is to give love, right? So what was but I think that, I'm not sure if that answers this question. So Go ahead.
Yeah, not fully, because the way that it's phrased is, nor is it enough to say that childish craving is one-sided, while mature love is willing to give and love us fully. So it's almost saying like that that's not the full picture, that mature love is willing to give love and love
Right.
as fully as one wishes to receive it, right? That second part, it's saying that there's more to it than just, like, that's not the definition of mature
Right.
love, is the way that I'm
That's
understanding
like
that sentence.
the duality that's like polarized, right? And so I
Uh-huh.
think what he's going to now is to say, you know, like, okay, so what's maybe the distortion and divinity on both sides, right?
Mm.
So let's read on and see maybe, but I think it says, I get what you're seeing there. It's a kind of it's a weird sentence a little, and I did misread it originally. So, nor is it enough to say that childish craving is one-sided while mature love is willing to give and love as fully as one wishes to receive. In the adult, the childish craving subtly merges with the mature love capacity. So the individual's justification remains. If I could only find such completely satisfactory love, I would be willing to give my all. So I think there he's talking about, I mean, it does seem to be a common distortion when we're looking for our partner, right? Like we're seeking, to find, this certain kind of love or whatever, and then we could love back, right? Um, and I think, he generally says, no, we need to risk love, we can't just wait till it's safe enough to love in some ways. Or we have the right person, and he even says in some places, we have to learn to love our enemies, right, or whatever. So it's a kind of active thing, but in this case, I'm not quite sure. So let's continue reading on and see if it makes more sense. The difference between the immature desire and the craving on the one hand, and the mature wish for love and pleasure supreme on the other, is not determined by intensity of feeling, but by the time element and the prevailing illusion of self versus the other. Often the gratification of an instinct or the fulfillment of a wish may produce a conflict because it may simultaneously prove damaging to another person. It may make you selfish. Thus, you feel you have to decide between pleasure and unselfishness, both of which are part of the divine purpose. Okay, so he's saying, like, it's not only a conflict between pleasure and unpleasure, but there's this kind of strange relationship between like our self, like the pleasure that we long for, and if it's going to prove disadvantageous for someone else, then it seems like we're bad to want the pleasure, because then we're selfish, right? Or if we go with, oh, let me take the pleasure, we're being uncaring towards somebody else somehow. And so it creates this kind of, like, it's like, I see it as a a cross conflict, right? Not within it, but between these two aspects, selfishness and pleasure. So how is one to cope with this duality? In the lecture, I showed you the illusion of self versus others, lecture on the transition in human development. There is no such thing as a true experience of bliss at the expense of another. Realization of this truth will come only as you proceed on this path. This wider vision will be attained also by a reflection on the time element. Instant gratification, the child's way, often sets one's own pleasure against the other. However, from an expanded version, this ceases to be true. The more mature one is, the better one will be able to connect cause and effect, even if they're not close together. Time is a product of your world of illusion, and therefore the length of time between cause and effect makes a great deal of difference in your comprehension and evaluation of things. The more a mature person, spiritually and emotionally, the more the aspects of illusion are outgrown. Although still in time, such a person begins to sense time's illusory character. Practically, this manifests in the ability to see cause and effect, even if they do not follow in direct sequence. When they do follow closely, even a very small child begins to make the connection and learns from it. The process of growth, therefore, is determined also by the ability to connect cause and effect even when they are separated in time. To learn this, you have to connect past and present causes and effects. You learn this anyway in your work on this path. You also have to cultivate patience as far as the present is concerned. If your instinctual drive towards wish fulfillment interferes with another person's happiness, or if for other reasons you cannot at once receive the gratification you long for, you can cultivate this wider outlook. Take the instantaneousness out of the wish, which is itself healthy, and you will begin to see the law taking its natural course and find that you can lift yourself out of time, at least to some degree. So the difficult choice between happiness and unselfishness exists only in the relative time element. So I've been working with this some, it's interesting to me because, I have sort of an impatience and my Aries nature, right? And so to stretch this time frame, right, is kind of a pause and a sitting back and a grounding from the impulsiveness and the demand in me, like that's there. But it's like when I am able to, and again, like it may be like I'm in a conflict between, you know, hey, this seems good for me, but it's like, so which is the truth? Which is the truth? Like I've learned more and more, just to sit in the not knowing, just to stretch the time, just to wait and see what is coming, and what arrives, because the universe is working it out. It's teaching, it's showing, it's revealing, it's kind of, asking us to just stay the course, breathe, pay attention, right? And notice what rises up in you, maybe what you do want to do, but like pause, not necessarily to act on it, and keep just being with it, because out of that something will emerge that will either unify the situation or clarify it, and the choice becomes then easier, right? And you're aligned, you feel, even if it is that I have to give up what I thought was my happiness, right? It's like you're not feeling like it's a sacrifice because you've unified it, you've seen the truth, you've recognized. So I think that's a part of what he's talking about there. Does that help and make sense out of I'm not sure if it makes sense out of it, but did that clarify it at all for anybody? If we go back, I think all the way through, he's just trying to, build this case that it's not always this kind of simple split, right? And when it's when we can't, just discern it, like we can just work to stay open, right, and explore to understand and learn more about the cause and effect. And I think it's kind of amazing when it does happen, right? But it does again take our sort of receptive, our surrender, right, to what is in the moment, rather than going into resistance and going into the battle or into the struggle or into the, like my way, or I have to have this, right? It's trusting at a deeper level that what's arising in the universe is really, a unique lesson on the blackboard, and it's coming to us, and there is an answer. There's a beautiful, harmonious answer, right? But it's not in our usual this side or the other side. of reaction. So we have to kind of sit with it, sit in that middle of that split, and not go into battle, but like become the unifying force by that very attitude, by that, seeking, like, okay, God, I know there's a deeper, wider truth here that's not either of my sides of things. I'm here listening, waiting, learning, right? Show me.
I don't know why my mind works like this, but it does. It's like if I had to put this whole lecture into like one sort of like concise lesson, it would be the more you fear, the less you live. It's not the more you fear, the more you die, because there's only living. So the more you fear, the less you live.
That's a good one.
That's
And I think it's what people feel. I mean, I know a lot of people suffer from anxiety a lot, and that's their deepest frustration with it, right? And I wish I mean, it's like that's another version of fear, that we kind of get stuck in us somehow. But yeah, it's.
I mean, even the duality we think the duality is life and death, but in actuality, it's just life. And the more you fear, the less you live.
Sounds like a good summary, Frank. And, here he's talking about, like, well, okay, if you're in a situation where you have to, you're longing for pleasure and there's pleasure in this direction, but, it seems like that going after that pleasure might, be in conflict with somebody else, somebody else causes pain, right? And so then how do we, go resolve that duality, right? Because we're supposed to, have the goodness, pleasure is our right at some level, right? And yet, we also, I mean, there's a prayer, that says, I wish all beings achieve their most intimate aspirations, right? It's like we want everybody to have all that they want, right? And so it's a difficulty in our soul when, we can get what we want, but the other guy doesn't. Now, somehow American greed seems to think, oh, good for me, I've got more than everybody else. But that's not, I think, the deeper spiritual reality, at least in my experience. I want everybody's happiness, not just mine. And so when it feels like, my happiness is going to be, at the cost of somebody else's, then there's a different, confusion here that gets worked out. And that was the other piece that I think this lecture was talking about, that we just were, there. So it's a addendum to, what you're saying, more life through, hanging in there, staying open, and trusting life, like you said, rather than going to the fear. And let's see how it resolves, see the lesson there.
I could put an addendum on there too, is my experience is oftentimes the fear will come up over in the relationship I'm in now. There's a truth that comes up into me that I need to communicate to her. And there's an intense fear attached to it. If I say this, she's going to be destroyed, or the relationship's over, or we're going to get into this massive argument. And yet, like if I stay with it a while, it's like giving my power away in much ways in my life. I have to say it as gently as I can, but it's got to be truth. And part of me is like, shit, this is going to be the end. This is going to end the relationship, or very possibly could. And I've done this at least a half a dozen times in the last year. And there is a shift that happens if I stay true to my truth, not to my being right. And she reacts usually, and then I keep staying in my truth, present with her. And it's an amazing thing, what comes out of it, I could never have predicted. It's she shifts, I shift in ways that I release some of the stuff I was talking about. She shifts her energy looking at it. And it's exactly what's being said right here in this lecture. But I have to have the courage to stick to my truth. And it's my truth in the sense that this is really I really want in my in a pleasure way, in a life or in a relationship. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but it's an amazing experience that scares the hell out of me. I go into it and it comes out a complete way that I have never dreamed of, and repeatedly.
That sounds exactly, yeah, beautiful. And that's what, to me, this is why I know this path is real, right? It's like, and it does it the miracles then can happen, and it's exactly what you're saying, and it's holding that, not going into, it's got to be one or the other. It's like both, and I want to be in my truth and with you, right? And then somehow when we get out of the avoidance of that and risk, dying that death, it's like, it sounds like it's the shaman's death for you in these last 6 months. You're really getting it sounds like a great relationship that you got starting to develop there, Dick. That sounds great.
Yeah, and I don't know where it's going, so I'm just taking a step at a time.
Absolutely. So let's see. So process of growth is determined by the ability to connect cause and effect when they're separated in time. And to learn this, we have to connect past and present causes. I think I read this, right? Yeah, we're getting towards the end here. To learn this anyway in your work on your path, you also have to cultivate patience as far as the present is concerned. Yeah, that's what I just read. So when your longing for happiness is not instantaneously fulfilled, this too appears as a kind of death. It can often feel like bleak misery, and in that sense seems like death to you. When you give up instant gratification, but retain the attitude of keeping alive in principle the wish to obtain what you seek, you are using the healthy way of coping with death. The giving up of the wish itself is really an unhealthy acceptance of death. As you become stronger in the healthy way, you are bound to experience that you do obtain what you want eventually. You cannot help but become aware also of the illusion of actual physical death, not by intellectual superimposition, but by the strength that comes from coping with dying every day, little by little, and confronting it in a healthy manner. Once you overcome this conflict, the pathway will be smooth toward the real strength of living, which lies in the strength of dying. And so there's some good Q&As, but I think it's a bit long and we're getting closer to the end here. Let me go ahead and see if there's a closing. So he says, this is not an easy lecture, my friend, and we've struggled with it. I'm going to be teaching it, or one of my students is going to teach it in year 5, so we'll see. It is. It's like, I can spend some more time with it as well. But it is. It's really fundamental to me as well in this kind of understanding of, like I like this idea of using death as this metaphor, right, of anything that we fear or we resist. And kind of in a Native American tradition, the Hanta Yo is this, it's a good day to die, right? It's like it's calling forth that courage and that affirmation that life and death are together, right? And we can't really have life without death. If we fear, like what you were saying, Frank, the death, we lose life, right? And so there's this beautiful again, unification of a duality. It's life and death, life in the midst of death, death in the midst of life. And all of it continues in, an eternal way, whether we're here physically or not. And even what we talked about earlier, like maybe when we die, we're just not in bliss and the ultimate oneness, but we still are in our process and still working, through these various forms of, learning and growth. So he says, be blessed each one of you. Divine strength and love envelops you. This love is a reality. May you feel it and carry it with you into your lives. Be blessed, be in peace, be in God. Okay, I'm sorry we didn't get all the way through it, but I think we're, as usual, I'm stumbling over some of the other concepts and like looking at these things from all kinds of angles. So I hope everybody enjoys these lectures the way that we do them. It's certainly not outlined and
Yes, very much so.
presented.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much so. Thank you, Darlene.
So Faye, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. I was listening and taking it all in.
Okay. So what did you think? Was it understandable? Did you like it at all? Was it all gobbledygook? What's your
I did understand some of it, but some of it I have to go back and read and try to understand it better.
Uh-huh. And this is one of the, like, further along. I mean, it's not really. It's like it's a lecture that's not. There's some that are much simpler than this one. Let's put it that way.
That's for
this
sure.
one is kind of like a combination. All of them are to some degree, but like it really brings in a lot of different concepts in the pathwork here that usually you get kind of a lecture at a time. So good for you for hanging in there with all of that.
Yeah, if this was your first lecture ever, then you picked a doozy.
Darlene, can I hang in for a few more minutes? Do you have a few more minutes?
Okay, sure.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
And I'm going to stop the recording here.